So I didn't include intro slides because I figured you guys could figure out who I am. Has anybody here ever heard me speak before? 2, 3, 4 of you, and you came back, see? Staying power, that's what we call it. I kind of fell into open source, although arguably I was genetically predisposed to it because I was wanting to change the world and I was pissed off about the way things were. I was working for Apple, and I was very upset because they were, the engineers I was working with, due to the way that Apple ran things, was having to black box the code that they had written previously for a different project. So, oh, here we go. So these guys wrote QuickTime, and then they split off into a new project that was dependent on QuickTime, and the QuickTime guys were mad because they left. So they locked down the code from them, and they were having to pretend that, having to black box and remember what they wrote. I thought, this is really inefficient. And then right about that time, open source started becoming known. This was 93, maybe? About the time that Linus started with Linux. And I thought, this has got to be better. Right? Transparency. So anyway, that's how I got into it. You guys old enough to know what this is? Okay, good. You hate it when your slides don't get... Okay, so I'm going to talk very quickly about the history of open source. How many of you guys have been involved with open source, for a long time? About half the room. Okay, good. So it won't be completely lost. Those of you who know all of this part, don't scream out the answers. Okay. Back at the beginning of time, all software was open source, by definition, because it was too messed up for it not to be open source. They were so just trying to get it to work at all that everybody shared everything with everybody else. There were no secrets. It was like one big research project that the whole computing world got involved in. And this is a picture of a famous group of people, the Homebrew Compute Club. There are a bunch of companies in Silicon Valley that came directly out of these hobbyists. They were people who wanted to own a personal computer. They had access, most of them, to big computers somewhere, but they wanted to use a personal computer, and that was an unimaginable dream for most of them back in that time. This is at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Auditorium. And they were all sharing because, again, they're just trying to get the thing to work. If you guys have ever seen a picture of an Altair, it's just a bunch of switches, right? And the recipes to get that thing to work were actually fascinating, and people were sharing them. How many of you guys have a hobby that doesn't have anything to do with computing? Do you all share information in your hobby? Does everybody pretty much share? Because it's a hobby. Right? So, how to make a model rocket, how to sew, how to make pretty much anything. The whole maker movement is basically not new. It's just the way hobbyists are. They share information. So at one time, computing was like that too. And what could be bad, right? But yeah, I like to take pot shots at Bill because I worked for Bill. And he's one of the many people that I have worked for, and I'm here to tell you the Department of Justice was not wrong. This is famously a picture of Bill at 19 after he was arrested for drunk driving in New Mexico. And look at how he's not even concerned, is he? That's because he knows his daddy is a really rich lawyer. This is a letter that he sent to the Homebrew Compute Club. He was mad as hell that they were using software and not paying for it. This letter was the whole beginning of the closing of the personal computer industry. This was Bill saying, damn it, we should be paid for our time. And I'm going to compile stuff and not give away my source anymore, and you should do that too, and you guys are slackers if you don't do that. And they started an industry, but not an open industry. Neither of the companies, the famous companies that came out of the Homebrew Club, were open. Of course, they were dealing with IBM, so some of it might not have been their fault. But that left programmers with a real dilemma. How many of you guys have felt like this when you worked for big companies? Yeah, this is pretty much what it feels like to be a coder in a big company. Because either you do your best work and it gets misused by the people that hold the marketing tools, or you get in trouble because you did work that the people didn't want you to do. Do you guys, I don't know, does this crowd know anything about Java? little bit. So Java is an example of something that was sort of half open for most of its life, but there were some of us inside of Sun that were trying to make it more open. Our friend James Duncan Davidson wrote something called Ant, which was a replacement for Make, because you could use Make with Java, but it kind of hiccuped every 2 seconds. So he wrote Ant so that that would be more adaptable to the Java environment. And he called me up and he said, I wrote this thing. He was in China. I wrote this thing. Can I open source it? And I was like, sure, why not? We already had Tomcat. Let's just throw it in there, And everybody uses Ant, right? We got in a lot of trouble for doing that at Sun. I mean, a lot of trouble. but it was the right thing to do, so. All right. Then along came, you guys know who this is? How many of you have ever seen Richard? Have you ever seen him do this? Imagine him doing this in your 5-star hotel in London, in the lobby, and then blessing the computers, right? They're really confused about that. You guys know what the Halo thing is? It's a disk drive. It's an old disk. So he used to carry this stuff around. He did have this insight. This is his chief insight. And the truth is, Richard is an amazing man because he had this insight and was able to articulate it. And he talked to Eben long enough that they figured out that they could make copyleft happen. That's actually pretty brilliant. And if you're involved in open source, even if you don't like the GPL, you still owe Richard for coming up with this idea in the first place, because he was kind of the first guy who said, let's figure out a way that it can't be closed. We have a way that Bill Gates can't get past. That's basically what he was trying for. So, but then of course Tim O'Reilly came along and said, that's a stupid name. Free is bad because it means no cost in a lot of places, and that's not what you're trying to say. Although you might be saying that, what you're trying to say is free as in freedom. Let's call it something completely different. This happened in 1998 in a famous meeting, and that's about the time that I got involved. Today we have to say open source has had undeniable impact. You guys recognize most of these logos, I'm guessing. Maybe not all of them, though. Do you guys know what the upper... Yeah, good job. Good job. I saw Nat the other day. They have a new company they're working on. This shows you how we did. Now, there were a bunch of us, Theo was one of them, there were a bunch of us that just flew around the world just convincing people that open source was really going to happen. And I personally did that job for about 10 years for 2 different companies. And this is what we got out of it. A deep adoption in a lot of places. This is a map that Red Hat did that shows places where there's open source. This one's even more interesting to you guys, which is where open source has made penetration in Europe. It's kind of interesting. So, obviously not everybody was pleased with this idea. In particular, our friends from Microsoft. This is a real Microsoft poster. And for a long time, this was their stance. So when I said we go around the world talking about open source, we'd go to places and we could always tell when they'd been there first, because we'd get weird questions, interestingly formulated questions like, but is it legitimate? Is it legitimate? Like, is software legitimate? What does that mean even, But that was how they would phrase the question. They had a lot of rhetoric designed to make people afraid, because nobody ever got fired for, buying Microsoft, right? So governments, for a long time, governments didn't get it. This guy, you probably don't know who he is unless you're American. Dylan, where are you? You know who that is? That's Richard A. Clarke, first head of Homeland Security. And he wrote a book later that was a whistleblowing book. He's kind of in trouble now because he told a lot of stories. But he and I and Tim O'Reilly met in about 2002 to talk about whether Linux was ever going to be secure enough for the US government. And he kept saying this, you Linux people are going to have to change the way you do things because we can't use your software, and you Linux people are very disorganized and we can't figure out who to talk to. And Jim and I are like, and finally I said, we are not you Linux people. In fact, most you Linux people aren't even American, and they don't care if you use their software, and you'll either figure out how to use it or you won't. And he was very upset. Lots of bluster. It really upset him. But now we have the White House checking in Drupal code, right? I mean, this happened in like just 8 years. Now the White House is a commit bit member of the Drupal Association. So back in 1998, this is what it looked like. It was really easy to get these big companies interested in open source because they saw it as an effective hedge against the biggest bully in town. That's literally what it came down to. And along the way, they also found value. So when I was at Sun and we started putting stuff into Apache, it wasn't because Apache was a great place to put software, although it is a great place to put software. It was because we didn't want Microsoft's web technology to beat out the servlet APIs that we'd built into Java. So they, Sun didn't want to open source Tomcat, but they did it because they thought they'd get deeper adoption that way. Netscape didn't want to create Mozilla, but they did it because that was the only answer they had against Microsoft. I mean, they were all motivated basically against Microsoft. Even Apple had an open source license. And in the early days of Mac OS X, they really tried to play up the openness of the Mach kernel. They don't seem to care so much now. But these days, we've got all these companies who are making announcements about how open source has fundamentally changed their business, or they wouldn't exist without it. You recognize all of those? Is there one you don't? Everybody got all of them? Which one? This one? That one? Yeah, that would be Microsoft Open Technologies. And I'm here to tell you, you can laugh, but they just became the 5th largest contributor to the Linux kernel. Believe it or not. Under unknown, the 1st largest contributor is Red Hat, of course, and the 2nd one is Intel, and the 3rd one is IBM. But Microsoft is 5th. So, they're finding value there. Okay, but what about the future? Because I was talking about the past and the present. What about the future? First of all, open source isn't automatic. This is supposed to make you think of open core, which is the current euphemism for we'd like to have all the marketing benefits of being open, but we don't really want to be open. We want to have some other thing that we put the word open on, but it isn't really open source. And the way that you can tell is because you as developers, first of all, it doesn't have an OSI license on it. Thank God for the OSI. I mean, I helped run that organization for 10 years. They're not great, but they are great at one thing, which is saying this is an open source license or this is not an open source license. And that helps all of you because you don't have to be lawyers, right? But open core is an example of companies wanting you to believe that they're open enough that you'll play with them, but they're not really open enough for it to be called open source, and you should stay away from that, in my opinion. Then there's the problem that the term open standard is still meaningless. So this is a picture of the OOXML spec stacked up next to the open document format spec, right? And you guys how many of you know the horrible story of OOXML? Not too many. So OOXML is Microsoft's answer to the open document format. Open document format, fully created at a standards body, XML-based, openly documented, backed by Sun at the time, and now IBM as well, and a few other companies, Novell, SUSE, and Red Hat. OOXML was Microsoft having to give up their file format. This was a political move. During the time that Sun was suing Microsoft, back in those days, we owned OpenOffice, or StarOffice, which those of you from Germany may remember using StarOffice when it was a product here in this country. Sun bought that product and almost immediately decided that they weren't going to use it for anything, so they were just going to write it off and send everybody home. And we realized that if they open sourced it as OpenOffice, that we could standardize the file formats and force Microsoft's hand and get them to finally open their file formats, because they just used that as an engine for printing money. And they got about 40% of their revenue out of changing that format just enough that everyone was forced to upgrade every time that they changed the product, right? So what we did was we did a lot of lobbying directly to government, particularly to the European Commission, saying, this is costing you money and it doesn't make sense, and why would you back this? And they bought on Open Office and the open document format. So they went to Microsoft and they said, we're going to stop using your products if you don't open this file format, and it forced their hand. But what they did was this spec, this impossible to read spec, which they then forced through ISO by buying seats. They screwed up ISO for the next 12 to 15 years, maybe 20 years. ISO will be a useless standards body because they bought all these fictitious seats to get them to vote this thing through. And now there's all these people in ISO that can't even read a spec, you know, much less one this big. They can't even read a normal spec. So open standards are screwed up. A long time ago, maybe 8 years ago now, OSI created a standards definition for open standards that got a little traction, but not a lot of traction. But I think you guys as open source developers should care about it. It was really simple. It said an open standard is one that can be freely re-implemented in open source. That means it's not RAND licensed, it's licensed openly. All of the documents are available to you. You as individual developers can freely download them and freely re-implement. Right? Rough consensus and working code. We think that's open source. And most of the people involved in standards still want to use that as a way to control the market. So they'll get people to standardize on the term open standard, even though it doesn't mean anything. And then they'll say, oh, we're open. Microsoft says this. We're all about open standards. Oracle says, it's in our DNA, open standards. It's all crap. So, and then a safe harbor is hard to find. This is a picture of an $80 million boat trying to heel over during the America's Cup. Those of you who have been following the America's Cup know that Oracle had it stacked to win. I think they, in the end, probably this weekend will not win because I think New Zealand is going to pull ahead, but partly because they got caught cheating. Like, it's not enough to specify the world's most expensive boat that only 2 countries can afford to have, but then you cheat a little bit, right? And I think these behaviors pervade the way that certain companies work. So, you know, how many open source projects is Oracle holding hostage right now? How many important ones? MySQL, right? So for those of you who don't know, during the acquisition of Sun by Oracle, there were problems with that in Europe. The Anti-Trade Commission people or Antitrust Commission people in Europe stopped that acquisition briefly because of MySQL, because it seemed like a conflict of interest for Oracle to own its main competitor in the free space. And so Oracle made a promise that they would continue to support MySQL for 5 years. After the acquisition closed. We have just finished year 4. So that tells you that we're right at the end of the lifetime of MySQL. Luckily, Monty Wadenius, who wrote MySQL, is pretty stubborn, and he's now writing MariaDB to basically deal with the fact that MySQL is about to die. So, but we thought that was a safe harbor. When they sold MySQL to Sun, they thought that was a safe harbor. Open Office. I couldn't imagine that Open Office was going to blow up the way that it did. You know, OpenJDK, Open LDAP, all the parts of Java, right? I mean, pretty much every open source project that Oracle now owns because of acquiring Sun is at risk, which is a lot. So there's no safe harbor. But there is something you can do. They can't stop this. You guys know about, back in the day, Napster was a centralized file sharing software, right, that Sean Fanning and Sean Parker wrote. Nutella was designed around the fact that Napster had the problem of being single centralized and easy to kill that way. Nutella was distributed. You guys are the distributed asset of open source. They can't stop all of us, is what it boils down to. You have to keep this up. You have to keep hacking. So who's this? Does anybody know? Tim O'Reilly. And what does he say? Create more value than you capture. Don't be afraid to give away a thing now and again. The point is that you create value, spread it around, In the alternate economy that open source represents, sharing and gift giving is so important, and you guys need to think about that. It's about community. This is the first year of DrupalCon. You can see there's maybe 100 people there, right? This is last year at DrupalCon. So creating a community that people actually want to hang out in. And because I'm an Apache member, I'm required to now say it's about community over code. Code's important, community's more important. So get to know the people that are in this room with you. Go to hackathons and hang out, drink an extra beer, and get to know each other. Go on vacation together. That sounds crazy, but a lot of people at Apache have very social lives together in addition to their professional lives, and it really helps that foundation hold it together. Okay, who's this? Come on, extra points. No, he's not French. Good job. Yeah, that's Jaron Lanier. That's right. I heard Jaron Lanier talk about this book last week. He says, think about nanopayments. He's very concerned about the middle class of the whole world and the internet causing problems for the middle class of the whole world by hiding value. A lot of the stuff that we do every day to interact with Google and build its value, or Facebook, or Amazon, or any company that you interact with all the time, that value is not being captured and it's not showing up in the economy. And he's worried about that. So he thinks nanopayments, back to what Ted Nelson used to say, is the way to go. This is a building at Kodak. You guys all know Kodak? They made film. This is what happened to Kodak. Okay? And he's making the point that Kodak, 20 years ago, had 140,000 employees and was worth $28 billion, and it's now in bankruptcy. Instagram just sold for $1 billion to 13 people. Only 13 people in that company. So the problem is, you can get a lot of work done on the internet without giving a lot of work to other people, and he wants us to think about that. You guys can think about that too. When you're building things, think about ways that not all the value gets sucked in, but you actually give value back to people. Okay? And then, who's that? This one's going to be really obscure. No? Nobody? That's Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand, in the 60s and 70s, had something called the Whole Earth Access Catalog. He figured out that hippies were going to need composting toilets and solar panels, and he kind of made a Sears catalog for them. He's now got a foundation called the Long Now Foundation, and he's involved in something very interesting. He's been asked by a bunch of scientists in National Geographic to head an effort to de-extinct certain species. So he's making carrier pigeons again. They're heading towards woolly mammoths, believe it or not. Right? they're basically using the DNA that they've found. And the fact that science around DNA is basically open source. Everybody shares the sequences. Everybody knows the mechanics of sequencing. They're working to recreate these species. And they're doing it for ecological reasons. And then who's this? This one I really want you to know. This is Jeff Hawkins. He founded Palm and later Handspring. And what he does with his brain these days is he worries about how the neocortex works. We all have one. It's about the size of a dinner napkin. It's the folded part on your brain, right? And it's basically the site of all learning. Every human that has ever learned anything used their neocortex to do it. He thinks that computers are not going to get faster, smarter, better than the threshold that they're hitting now until they start thinking like humans. And so he started building algorithms that are based on how the neocortex actually works. He wrote a book called On Intelligence, but this year he made a very unusual decision. He decided to open source all of his algorithms. He spent 8 years developing them and a lot of money. And the reason he did it was because he wants to see research leap forward. He's frankly already made his money, mean, he needs to recoup a little bit, but not much. Mostly, he wants to see this stuff out in the human population so that people like you that might be interested in working with these things can actually get in and work with them. You can use them to do all kinds of interesting predictions. You can already set them up and they can learn stuff. I've seen demos done in about 24 hours where they teach a computer to learn music, they teach a computer to make decisions, or to teach a robot to move more effectively and make predictions the same way a human brain would. But he decided to open source these things using Apache. So if you're interested in that, go to numenta.org. And now, a little game. How many of you are members of this organization? Good. How about this one? Fewer. These are the people that have the trademark on the word open source, and they're the ones that you can go to quickly to find out if a license is an open source license. How about this one? Wow, you're good. You guy in the middle there is very, very philanthropic. This is Creative Commons. It's not exactly open source, although about half of their licenses would qualify, but it's for open content. And how about this one? This is the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Now, how many of you have a VCR or a DVR in your house? Cable TV. Wow, how about internet? Okay. How much do you spend a year on internet? Is it more than 100 euros? More than 1,000 euros? All year? Yeah? That's how much you should be giving to the EFF every year. Because if you get in trouble for something that you do on the net that should be legal, they've got your back. Nobody else does. This is insurance for free internet. You guys should all be helping them. Okay. So mostly what I want you to hear is participation is ownership in open source. It's true that there are big companies and there are big sales that happen and it screws things up and the motives get upset, you know, but ultimately it's down to what each and every one of you guys decide, and women, decide to do with your time and your open source energy. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to, because they can't really stop all of you. They can only sort of stop big entities that they can throw money at. You need to back the small organizations that help you get the outcomes of transparency and openness that are kind of part of why you're here. And you have to realize that you are open source. Ultimately, you are open source, and the community that you're involved with is open source. That's the main thing that I've learned from the last 15 years of working in this. And, you know, all I can say is it's a very rewarding group of people to hang out with, and I hope that you'll take the time while you're here to meet some people that you didn't know before, and that every time you go somewhere, you'll explain this to them, because that participation as ownership thing is the hardest thing for people to get. But it's really true. So anyway, that's what I have to say. I hope that, you know, you guys found something in there. I'll be around, so feel free to come and ask me the story about Jimmy Page if you'd like. Thank you.